Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Enter the Bible podcast, where you can get answers or at least reflections on everything you wanted to know about the Bible, but were afraid to ask. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Catherine Schifferdecker, and our special guest again today is Reverend Dr. Sarah Hinlicky Wilson, who's a friend of ours, and a wonderful theologian and pastor. She is associate pastor at Tokyo Lutheran Church in Tokyo, Japan. And she had to get really early this morning to join us on this podcast. So thank you for doing that,
bonus.
And point. She is a creator and co-host of a wonderful podcast called Queen of the Sciences, which she does with her father, who is also a theologian, Paul Hinlicky, who has been a guest on this podcast as well. So welcome again, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. I'm thrilled to be here.
Good. So our question today comes from a listener. And again, as usual, for those of us listening or viewing us, if you have a question about the Bible, please go to enterthebible.org and send it to us. We can't answer all the questions that come, but we'll do our best to address as many as possible. So this one is, what are the beliefs concerning, what are current beliefs, Christian beliefs, concerning the book of Revelation? And this listener wants to understand what these beliefs are, particularly premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. And just, we were joking as we... before we started to record that we're not talking about millennials, of which Katie is one.
Not talking about millennials.
Not talking about millennials. We're talking about some belief systems about the end of time, about millennialism. So, Sarah, maybe if you could start out just by defining those terms, that would be really helpful, I think.
Right. So the reason why it sounds like the generational term millennial is because it refers to millennium, which means the 1,000 years or the 1,000-year marker. So millennials as a generation got that name because of when they were born. But this millennialism, these sets of millennialisms from Revelation have to do with a specific passage. So actually, if it's okay, I'll read the passage first because that'll make it easier to define the terms.
Yes, that would be helpful.
Okay. So this is from Revelation. Oh, and let me just say clearly, it's Revelation. There's no S at the end because this book is one revelation of the one Jesus Christ. If there's anything that makes me tear out my hair and want to stab a knife through my heart, it's hearing people refer to the book of Revelations. It's just one revelation of just one.
There's only
Jesus
one
Christ.
In there. It's a really long one, though.
As soon as I got this question, I was like, if I say nothing else, if listeners remember nothing else, it's going to be that it's just Revelation. Okay, I'm over it. So this is from Revelation chapter 20, verses 1-6. I will read it. This is from the English Standard Version. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for, let's say it all together, 1,000
years.
So what chapter again in the book of Revelation is that? So
that's chapter 20, verses 1-6.
All right.
Well, I think
so. It's
that's
very
pretty
close
clear.
To the end.
Yes.
That's okay. Clear as mud.
That's so clear. I mean, that's exactly what I was taught when I was growing up, is that, the millennium hadn't happened yet, but Jesus was going to come down and he was going to like burn up all the bad people. And then Satan would go into into his own little prison for 1,000 years, and all the good people would get resurrected and like hang out with Jesus. And then after the 1,000 years, Satan would come back for a while, and then we'd beat him for good this time. And then all the other people that weren't as good as us, they would get resurrected then.
Mm.
But they wouldn't have as much fun.
No, they would not. They would be bummed out for the 1,000 years while we were all hanging out together. So I think that the book of Revelation just showed how true that was. Boom.
There you go. So what you have just described is premillennialism. That is the term that is used to describe it. Right. So this is the idea that before the whole earth is restored, there will be the 1,000 years, millennialism, of Jesus and his special group of saints hanging out on the earth after all the bad guys have been dealt with. That's the premillennialist version. So that is the most literal reading of this passage, obviously. The postmillennial postmillennialism is kind of an attempt to deal with this by bringing it down into the plane of ordinary historical development. So postmillennialism is more like the idea that once human beings have finally gotten their act together, established the kingdom of God on earth through their diligent, faithful efforts, and 1,000 years of peace and progress take place, then Christ will come and say, "Good job, guys. Now we're ready to, put this thing on steroids and go for the big time." But it's 1,000 years basically of human effort at bringing about the peaceable kingdom. This is generally
like a lot of work.
Yeah, I don't think we've achieved. I don't think we've achieved even 1 year of such.
Well, of course not. Of course not. Yeah. So this one is not believed in usually such a literalistic way. However, it is sort of, I would say it's implicit and has been very much interwoven with, especially since the Enlightenment, ideas about modernity and progress and moral improvement over time. Whenever you hear someone easily dismiss that back then they were bad and they were ignorant and they didn't know better, but now we do and now we're doing better, that is drawing on what is functionally the postmillennialism of a lot of progressive or Enlightenment type thinking, that we can do it, we just need to do it, we get our acts together, and we can bring the kingdom. And that animated a lot of like social gospel thinking and other reform movements that often were in explicit tension with this more like cataclysmic approach of premillennialism.
Yeah.
Then we have amillennialism, and this is the shocking idea that Revelation is not literal, it's not a code, and it's not an allegory, but it is a revelation of Jesus Christ and must be understood theologically through its native language of symbolism, which is not a code and is not an allegory, but it's a different mode of literature or understanding, that because it is so unnatural to us, it is by definition unnatural. People have a hard time with it and they want to make it purely literalistic, or they turn it into some sort of backup for their own ambitions and ideologies for this worldly, in postmillennialism, it would be progress. So amillennialism says, yes, something significant theological is going on here, but we are not meant to read it as a literal prediction or a literal mandate for what we are supposed to be doing. But all the times, and including the end time, are in God's hand. God has told us very little about what it's going to look like. Jesus himself said, I don't even know when the end is coming. So if even the Son of God doesn't know, how could anyone else possibly know? So this is a deliberately, let's call it agnostic position, that surely in some way God will fulfill his promise to restore the whole earth, but we don't know how, we don't know when, and it is not our job to even speculate, much less declare to the world at large when and how it's going to happen. Guess which side I'm on?
Yes. Yeah. Me too. So locate for me this series of books and movies that were popular, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. The Left Behind series. I assume that's the
It's premillennial.
Yeah.
Well, okay, that's true, but there's a long prehistory to premillennialism. And I think actually, even though this will take us really far back, I think this will be helpful. Because, of course, as you know, both Old and New Testaments have apocalyptic language and literature within them. Even like the Gospels, like, Mark 13, Jesus' prediction of the end times, that's apocalyptic within the Gospel, which otherwise is not explicitly, it's more history, biography, even if a theological one. But even as early as one of the church fathers, Irenaeus, who lived around the year 200, so pretty early in post-biblical Christian literature, he's already looking at Revelation 20 and trying to make sense of it. And he has a little fun, does a little light numerology, trying to figure out, he's basically saying...
I heard you could do that. I heard that on the internet. If you type in this, if you Google it, it'll tell you that if you count this many characters, then you could know. That's what I heard.
Right. Well, and of course, people figured out very early in, human development that numbers are cool and you can do weird stuff with it. And you can have letters and numbers match up. Like that has been done. The problem is if you read it as a code or if you read it as a symbol. And Revelation is full of numbers, but they're symbolic numbers. They're not code numbers and they're not math numbers. They're symbol numbers. So anyway, Irenaeus plays around, has some fun. But then after trying it out, he concludes, and this is really important. Okay, this is from the year 200. He says, "It is more certain and less hazardous to await the fulfillment of the prophecy than to be making surmises and casting about for any names that may present themselves, inasmuch as many names can be found possessing the number mentioned, and the same question will, after all, remain unsolved." So 1800 years ago, one of our greatest church fathers got it. We will never know. This is something, again, in Jesus' hands. Jesus is the one who will answer these questions and make these prophecies true in whatever way he intends to make them true. Alas, that has not stopped Christians from indulging not in light numerology, but deep and dark numerology and getting themselves very panicked. Like when the year 1000 rolled around, everyone was like, oh my gosh, it's been 1,000 years since Jesus. We're all going to die. And then time kept ticking along and they're like, oh, maybe it wasn't that millennium. And ever since actually...
We did it again in 2000.
Yeah, that happened again in 2000. Yeah.
But actually, there's a Wikipedia page of all the predictions of the end of the world just from Christians through history. And it's hilarious reading because there have been so many and they've all been wrong. There's been 100% failure rate in predicting the end, which evidently never stops someone from trying again because this time I'm going to be right. But yeah, so and like the reformers, they weren't like the Lutheran reformers were not super bad about it, but they saw massive upheaval and they were kind of worried sometimes. Pietists got into it for a while. I would say most errors of the magisterial Reformation and Catholics or Orthodox have basically said, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. This is a bad idea. But unfortunately, that didn't eliminate it. It just passed into a different holding tank. And so the sort of the forefather of modern, especially premillennialist thinking is this guy named John Nelson Darby. He's the founder of the Plymouth Brethren, a British kind of break-off evangelical group in the 19th century. And he was super duper into predicting the end. And then a lot of his ideas were taken up into the Scofield Reference Bible, which was one of the most widespread Bibles, especially in the US. It's from early 20th century sometime. I think maybe close to the outbreak of the First World War, which you can understand brought on a lot of apocalyptic panic again.
Yeah.
But it's basically a Bible that like tells you, like goes through and picks out all the prophecies and how they have been or are going to be fulfilled. And that is really what, like, I have to say, use this bad word, but like infected the American Christian imagination. And there's something, I think there's a lot of mix up in just the whole American project of like such immense promise and such immense darkness and like trying to sort out are we going the right way or the wrong way, and how do we know, and who's on what side, and the greatest freedoms in the world ever sitting on top of, mass death of Native Americans, enslavement of African Americans, amazing industrial progress, but then loss of land, and, being a place that everybody wants to come to and sees as a beacon of hope. So you get such conflicting signals within the American experiments that if you want a clean answer, are we getting better or are we getting worse? If you think we're getting better, you're a postmillennialist. If you think we're getting worse, you're a premillennialist. If you think it's probably not either or, it's probably both, and maybe we do not within ourselves have the key to history, then you choose the right answer, which is you're an amillennialist. How many more times can I say this before we're done?
Okay. Go ahead. Well, I was just going to
say, so the Left Behind thing, right? Like,
yeah,
I know that's not as popular now, but 10, 15 years ago, there were lots of people, and it was, in popular literature, and the airline pilot who gets raptured, right? We haven't used that word yet.
Yeah, the rapture. I forgot about the rapture.
Taken away, and then the airplane crashes. Whatever. It's I like how you classify it, Sarah, that it reflects our own conflicting feelings about our society, right? Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? There are so many times where it seems like things are going to hell in a handbasket, right? And so this kind of belief, I don't hold this belief myself. Like you, Sarah, I think amillennialism is not, not being a millennialist is the right choice. But I can see the attraction. That's where I wanted to go, right? That if everything looks terrible at any particular point in history, well, maybe it's a sign of the end times and Jesus is going to come back soon, right? So you're looking through the book of Revelation, which is a weird book in many ways.
So weird. It is a weird book.
To find some hope. And it is those times, especially when the church is persecuted or when it seems like the end of the world is near. I think it's those times when the book of Revelation comes more to prominence, and not in bad ways, like we're talking about with the Left Behind series or whatever, but also in good ways, just to remember and to be reminded that God is God, right? And that yes. God has God's will be done in the end. That is the restoration of all that is good, and that God will reign at the end of days, right? Even if it doesn't seem that way now.
Yeah, I think we should come back maybe as we finish up about what Revelation, the book of Revelation, is for, but to try to give now a slightly more charitable gloss on this. Like you were saying, why are people attracted to this kind of Left Behind or premillennialist, or also sometimes called dispensationalist thinking? Right. I think one thing is that as soon as you realize there is history, you can't help but asking where you are in it. And how do you interpret it? Is history one damn thing after another? Is there a narrative thread? Are things inevitable or are they contingent? Are we close to the end or are we still close to the beginning? Like you can't, once you know there's history, you have to ask those questions. But it's almost impossible to get a very satisfying answer to any of them. There's also a question of whether the origin is greater or the goal is greater. So one kind of thinking says it was perfect in Eden and everything has been declined since. And the goal is to get back to Eden. But another way of looking at it is saying Eden was a launching point that was never complete in itself. And yes, things went terribly awry when Adam and Eve ate the apple and were expelled for the garden. But nevertheless, the goal was always going to be greater than the origin. And the church fathers also had this idea of the Felix Culpa, the happy fault of sin because it opened the doorway to even greater than the origin itself could have contained, which was the incarnation and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So I think that's one thing, is that nobody gets out of historical thinking. And we might not like this method of historical thinking, but I have a huge problem with a lot of secular forms of historical thinking too. So it's not, I think we're more irritated by the Left Behind version because it's like inside our camp. We want fellow Christians to do better, but it's not like the problem doesn't exist on the outside. I think also in the specific case of the Left Behind books, I think they were expressing a very literal feeling of being left behind. And, since those books have come out, we have seen a kind of gutting of the working class, more and more of the middle class, Americans who feel that their nation does not represent them or speak for them, is hostile to their values. So, this was a way of giving people who felt really left behind, neglected, uncared, unvalued, the deplorables, it gave them a feeling of importance and value. Now, I would say Revelation itself, when it addresses martyred people, actually at every move blocks revenge fantasies. Mm-hmm. So the idea that, these bad people are going to be in car and airplane crashes because they weren't good enough to be raptured fundamentally misunderstands the message of Revelation. But if we talk just about human emotion and social movements, I think that's one of the reasons why this is so powerful. It is a way, like if you have spiritual insight into the way reality really works, the way God's real plan, if you're on the right side of history, then it gives you a power in your state of powerlessness. And I think it's hard for Americans now to hear that powerless people are not necessarily virtuous people. They should not be. They should be invited into power and responsibility and not denied privileges and opportunities. But powerless people don't just become good because they have no power. They can be resentful. They can be vengeful. They can use their weakness as a tool of moral control. And I think that's one version. The Left Behind series is tapping into that very ugly human characteristic as well. And that's another reason to oppose it. But unless we address also the root cause of the feelings and find some other ways of inviting us, if we are in that category, into a different way of relating to the injustices and power imbalances, then I can see why that's an attractive option.
So if Revelation is not about the preparing us for the literal millennium, and if we're also not ushering in the millennium by our acts of good works and justice and mercy, then what even is the point of the book of Revelation?
To confuse.
Well, it's to give hope, I think. I mean, in all of its weirdness and all of its symbolism and, oblique references like, Babylon is Rome. And, it's to say in the end, the blood that is shed is the blood of the Lamb. And it is the crucified and risen Lamb, Jesus Christ, who is to be worshipped and glorified. And that in the end, God wins, right? The beast doesn't win, yeah. Satan doesn't win, the Antichrist doesn't win, right? No matter how bad things look, and remember John of Patmos, John is writing this exiled to an island, things aren't cheery for him, right? No matter what it looks like on the ground, God wins in the end. And not the God of the Greeks and Romans or the God of empire, but the God that we know most fully in Jesus Christ, right? The one who gave himself in love for the sake of the world, the self-giving, sacrificial Lamb of God who gives himself for the sake of the world. So in all its weirdness, I think the book of Revelation in the end is a book about hope.
Yeah, I think it's written of and for martyrs, and not people who think they're martyrs or who vainly wish to be martyrs, but people who are actually facing their own blood shed from a power that doesn't care about shedding blood, is just happy to get rid of them. And I think on some level, Revelation is really meant for those people above all, and we can do our best from positions of scholarship and security to understand it in the most responsible and theologically insightful way possible. But I think in some respect, most of Revelation is not for us. However, to immediately caveat that, at the beginning are the letters to the 7 churches, and they range from faithful churches to lukewarm churches to nearly apostate churches. And in that respect, all churches are called to read this book and recenter themselves on the theology of the ultimate martyr, who is Jesus Christ, of course, the Lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world, as Revelation says. And then Revelation ends after all the enemies have been dealt with and all the suffering is behind. I mean, the very last bit is the vision of God and humanity fully reconciled through Christ, dwelling together in a transformed heaven and earth. And in that respect, even if you lead a pretty decent life with relatively low suffering, you're still going to die. You're still going to see other people around you die. That is the ultimate apocalypse that awaits everybody. And in that respect, at least the last chapter of Revelation is also for you. And it's the last chapter of the Bible. And it is the goal towards which we're heading, which I would say does exceed the origin, this full integration in a loving fellowship of God with all of his people.
The new heaven and the new earth, where God will wipe the tears from all faces, and death will be swallowed up forever. Yeah. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for explaining all the millennialists. You haven't explained the millennials, but the millennialists.
Well, there's lots of books on that one, too.
There are a lot of books on millennials, too, yeah. Thank you so much. You, as usual, have just explained things very clearly and articulately, and we really appreciate your depth, sharing your depth of knowledge with us, and your, I think, insightful critiques and insights about Western societies. So thank you. Thank you to our listeners, again, for listening to this episode of the Enter the Bible podcast. You can get high-quality courses, commentaries, resources, videos, and other reflections at enterthebible.org. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like us and recommend us to your friends. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay.
See you soon.
Bye.